There's this curse in science fiction filmmaking. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean there is genuinely a pattern so consistent across so many productions that it starts to feel like the genre is haunted. It goes like this. Someone has a big idea. Studios get excited, money starts flowing, and then, somewhere between the vision and the finished product, everything goes completely sideways. Sets get destroyed, directors get fired, actors nearly die, and the bill just keeps growing. What I want to talk about today are the 10 films where that spiral went to genuinely insane places. We're talking productions that collapsed companies, ended careers, and, in a few cases, almost ended lives. Let's get into it. Number 10, Battlefield Earth, 2000. Okay, so we're starting here, and I want you to understand just how special this one is. Battlefield Earth is not merely a bad movie. It is a monument to bad decisions, stacked on top of each other, on top of a foundation of fraud. It is, somehow, worse than it sounds. This was John Travolta's pet project. He'd been trying to get it made for over a decade, based on a novel by L. Ron Hubbard. Yes, the guy who founded Scientology. Travolta was a dedicated member of the church, loved the book, and genuinely believed this was an important story that Hollywood needed to tell. Studios disagreed. Repeatedly, for years, every major player passed. Nobody wanted to make a movie based on a book written by one of the most controversial figures in American religious history. But Travolta wouldn't quit. He eventually invested $5 million of his own dollars, leveraged every bit of his star power, and got the thing greenlit with a budget of around $73 million. And then things got weird. It later came out that the production company, Franchise Pictures, had been lying to investors about how much the film actually cost, inflating the numbers and pocketing the difference. This wasn't creative accounting, this was straight-up fraud. The kind that ends with lawyers. Meanwhile, the actual movie was its own disaster. Director Roger Christian, who, to his credit, had won an Oscar for set decoration on the original Star Wars, made the baffling choice to film almost every single scene at a tilted angle. This technique is called a Dutch angle, and it's supposed to make things feel unsettling. Used once in a while, it works. Used in literally every scene for 2 hours, it just makes people feel like they need to lie down. Travolta and Forrest Whitaker stumbled around in alien costumes with dreadlocks and platform boots, delivering dialogue that sounded like someone had fed a bad novel into a broken translator. Critics didn't just pan it, they treated it like a public health emergency. At the box office, $29 million, on a $73 million budget. The fraud lawsuit came next. Franchise Pictures was ordered to pay nearly $120 million in damages. The company went bankrupt. One movie, one studio, gone. And that's just number 10. Number 9, Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, 2001. This one genuinely hurts, because the people who made it actually believed they were doing something revolutionary. And technically, they kind of were. Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, was supposed to be the first feature film with photorealistic CGI humans. Not cartoon humans, not stylized humans. Realistic humans, indistinguishable from actors. The team at Square Pictures had spent years developing the technology, obsessing over details like how light hits skin and how individual hairs move. Each character had 60,000 hairs that were rendered independently. 60,000 per character. The budget hit $137 million. To give you some context, Pixar's Monsters, Inc. came out the same year for around $115 million. And that had an entire major studio behind it. The Spirits Within was built on the back of a video game company betting its future on one film. Here's the problem nobody wanted to say out loud. The story was incomprehensible. Set on a dying Earth invaded by ghostly alien creatures called phantoms, the film followed a scientist named Aki Ross, searching for spiritual energy signatures to save humanity. It had almost nothing to do with the Final Fantasy games beyond sharing a name, which immediately alienated the massive fanbase who was expecting, I don't know, chocobos and Gil and someone named Cloud. And for regular moviegoers who didn't care about Final Fantasy, the plot was just dense and joyless and weirdly philosophical in a way that didn't connect. Worldwide gross, $85 million. Against $137 million budget. Square Pictures shut down completely. The losses were so severe they nearly sank Square's entire parent company, which was eventually forced to merge with rival Enix just to survive. The studio built to change cinema forever was dismantled by a single film. The technology was real. The ambition was real. Nobody showed up. Number 8. The Abyss, 1989. James Cameron on this list twice shouldn't surprise anyone. The man treats production budgets the way a magician treats a tablecloth. He grabs it and pulls, and everything goes flying. The Abyss started with a budget of around $33 million and a straightforward-sounding pitch. Deep-sea oil workers discover something alien at the bottom of the ocean. Cameron, naturally, decided the only honest way to make this film was to actually go to the bottom of the ocean, or as close as film equipment would allow. They took over an abandoned nuclear reactor containment facility in South Carolina and filled it with 7 million gallons of water. Cast and crew spent entire days submerged, breathing through regulators between takes, shooting in conditions that were, there's no other word for it, brutal. The stories from that set are something else. Ed Harris reportedly cried in his car after particularly bad shooting days. At one point, his breathing regulator failed underwater and he nearly drowned. Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio had a full breakdown during a CPR scene that required take after take after take. Both of them have been famously reluctant to talk about this film since. When people ask Ed Harris about The Abyss in interviews, he either gives one-word answers or just goes quiet. Cameron himself ran 18-hour shooting days. Crew members described him as militaristic. Cameras flooded constantly. Lighting rigs failed. Every single day brought a new crisis that added time and money. The budget ended up around $43 million, a 30% overrun that, honestly, feels modest compared to what's coming later on this list. The box office was disappointing. It didn't become the cultural touchstone anyone expected. But here's what The Abyss actually was: a test run. The water tentacle sequence Cameron developed for this film directly led to the liquid metal effects in Terminator 2 2 years later. He was learning, just learning expensively, and at everyone else's emotional expense. Number 7. Superman Returns, 2006. Superman Returns is a fascinating kind of financial tragedy because the movie hadn't even started shooting before it had already lost tens of millions of dollars. Here's the context. After Superman 4 bombed in 1987, Warner Brothers spent the next 18 years trying to bring Superman back to theaters, and every attempt collapsed before cameras rolled. The most famous of these was Superman Lives, Tim Burton directing, Nicolas Cage as Superman. There's concept art floating around online of Cage in some kind of glowing suit that looks nothing like the costume anyone recognizes, and the script went through writers including Kevin Smith, who has told genuinely incredible stories about the experience. A producer apparently demanded that Superman never fly, and that the film include a giant mechanical spider. I'm not making that up. Superman Lives died. Other projects followed. All of them died too. By the time Bryan Singer finally got Superman Returns into production, Warner Brothers had spent somewhere between $40 and $50 million on failed development. All those scripts, concept designs, pre-production costs, that money got folded into the budget of the movie that actually got made. Superman Returns ended up with a reported production cost of $270 million, making it one of the most expensive films ever made at that point. Singer made it as a love letter to the 1978 Richard Donner original, essentially a direct sequel that ignored the third and fourth films. Brandon Routh was genuinely good casting. He looked remarkably like Christopher Reeve, but the film was slow, melancholy, and light on action in ways that frustrated audiences expecting a blockbuster. It earned $391 million worldwide. Under normal circumstances, that's a solid number. But to break even on a $270 million film, you need somewhere north of $550 million. Superman Returns didn't get there. Warner Brothers quietly took the loss. Sequel plans were dropped. The saddest part? The movie earned a perfectly respectable amount of money. It just didn't have a chance from the start, because it was carrying 20 years of someone else's failed dreams before it even opened. Number 6. Jupiter Ascending, 2015. After the Matrix trilogy made almost $2 billion, the Wachowskis could do pretty much whatever they wanted, and what they wanted, eventually, was this. Jupiter Ascending cost $179 million and told the story of a cleaning woman named Jupiter, played by Mila Kunis, who discovers she's actually the genetic reincarnation of an alien queen and heir to an intergalactic empire. Channing Tatum played a half-wolf, half-human soldier in hover boots who's sent to protect her. On paper, that sounds like exactly the kind of wildly imaginative sci-fi the Wachowskis made their name on. In practice, it was baffling. The first warning sign came when Warner Brothers yanked it from a summer 2014 release date and bumped it to February 2015. The official reason was that the visual effects needed more time. The real reason, which the industry read immediately, is that you don't move a nearly $200 million blockbuster into February, historically the dumping ground for film studios have lost faith in, unless you're quietly bracing for disaster. The disaster arrived on schedule. $47 million domestically, $81 million internationally, a worldwide total of about $181 million, which sounds okay until you realize that barely covers the production budget and doesn't touch the marketing costs. Critics had opinions about Eddie Redmayne's performance that were not polite. He played the villain by alternating between barely whispering and suddenly screaming, with nothing in between, and the internet has never really let that go. For the Wachowskis, this effectively ended the era of studios handing them enormous budgets. Their next big project was the Netflix series Sense8, built at a completely different scale. They did eventually return to the Matrix franchise, but resurrections in 2021 suggested that lightning had not struck the same place twice.
Number 5. Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, 2017. Luc Besson had been thinking about this movie since he was a kid reading French comics. The series Valerian and Laureline had been a massive influence on his career, including The Fifth Element, and when CGI technology finally caught up with what he'd been imagining for 30 years, he decided to go for it. The resulting film cost $200 million and became the most expensive independent film ever made, and the most expensive non-American film ever made. Besson's own company, EuropaCorp, was financing this, not a major Hollywood studio with a diversified slate to absorb a big loss. His own company betting an enormous chunk of its financial stability on one movie. The film had over 2,300 visual effects shots. For comparison, Rogue One, a Star Wars story, a film set in a galaxy full of spaceships and alien planets, had around 600. The opening sequence, showing a space station growing over centuries as different civilizations arrive and connect, is genuinely one of the most creative things I've seen in modern sci-fi cinema. Besson can construct a world. The leads, though, Dane DeHaan and Cara Delevingne, didn't work. DeHaan was miscast in a role that needed someone with more commanding presence. Delevingne, known primarily as a model, hadn't yet developed the acting range the character needed, and the whole movie rested on their chemistry, which the audience largely didn't feel. $40 million domestically, around $225 million worldwide, for a film that cost $200 million before a single poster was printed. EuropaCorp nearly collapsed. The company required significant restructuring just to stay alive. The most expensive European film ever made couldn't find enough people who wanted to watch it. Number 4. Blade Runner 2049, 2017. I want to be upfront about something. Blade Runner 2049 is one of the best films of the last decade. Denis Villeneuve made something genuinely extraordinary. Roger Deakins' cinematography is so good that the Academy finally gave him the Oscar he deserved for years. The film is patient and strange and quietly devastating. It also lost somewhere around $80 million, which tells you something pretty brutal about how the movie industry works. The original Blade Runner flopped in 1982. It's only considered a masterpiece now because of decades of home video sales and critical reassessment. So making a sequel 35 years later was already a gamble. Doing it with a budget between $150 and $185 million, with an Alcon Entertainment, a relatively small company, taking on the financial risk, was a significant roll of the dice. It opened to $32 million domestically, $175 million internationally, $267 million total against a total investment, production plus marketing, well past $300 million. The postmortems were painful. Ridley Scott suggested it was too long at nearly 3 hours. The marketing was deliberately secretive, which protected the surprises but also failed to tell casual audiences what the movie was actually about. And the truth is, the audience for a slow, contemplative sci-fi noir was always going to have a ceiling, no matter how brilliant the film was.
Blade Runner 2049 proved something the industry keeps needing to relearn. You can make a masterpiece and still lose. Critical consensus doesn't buy tickets. Oscars don't pay back production budgets. And sometimes the movie you love most is the one that quietly bankrupts someone. Number 3. Mortal Engines, 2018. The pitch for Mortal Engines is one of the most genuinely creative things to come out of sci-fi literature in recent memory. Post-apocalyptic Earth. Civilization has moved on to giant mobile cities, London, Prague, other major centers, all mounted on massive wheels and treads, rolling across a devastated landscape, consuming smaller settlements for parts and resources. Municipal Darwinism, the book calls it, cities eating cities. Visually, the film delivers on that premise. The opening sequence, where London bears down on a tiny mining town that desperately tries to outrun it, is legitimately thrilling. The scale is staggering. The effects team built something that had never been put on screen before. But Peter Jackson's name on the poster, he produced and co-wrote, set expectations that the film couldn't meet, and everything surrounding the visuals fell flat. The two lead actors, Hera Hilmar and Robert Sheehan, are talented people who got very little to work with. Hugo Weaving was underwritten. The romantic subplot had no pulse. The marketing kept leaning on, "from the makers of Lord of the Rings," which is a sentence that makes people expect a certain quality of storytelling. What they got was a film that had clearly been shaped by committee, borrowing heavily from Star Wars and Mad Max without capturing what made either of those things work. Worldwide gross, $83 million, against a budget that, with marketing included, reportedly reached well over $200 million. The sequel plans, there were 4 books in the series, were canceled immediately. Universal took a loss estimated anywhere between $130 and nearly $250 million, depending on who you believe. One of the biggest flops of 2018, full stop. Number 2. Solo, a Star Wars story, 2018. For 40 years, Star Wars was basically impossible to lose money on. Every film turned a profit. Most of them were events. The brand was so powerful that audiences would show up for almost anything with that title card. And then, Solo. The project started reasonably enough. Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, the Lego Movie, 21 Jump Street, were hired to direct a Han Solo origin story on a budget of around $125 million. Modest by Star Wars standards. A tighter, character-focused story. Lord and Miller are known for their improvisational style. They encouraged actors to experiment, to deviate from the script, to try things. By the accounts that later emerged, one actor described their shooting approach as spending an entire day on scenes that their replacement would cover in an hour. Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy, and by extension the franchise's caretakers, were not thrilled. The approved screenplay by Lawrence Kasdan was being treated as a starting point rather than a blueprint. 4 months into filming, with roughly 80% of the movie shot, Kennedy fired both directors. Ron Howard came in 2 days later. And here's where it gets expensive. This wasn't a situation where Howard finished the remaining 20% and wrapped up. Lucasfilm wanted around 85% of the existing footage reshot. Howard ended up filming about 70% of the finished movie, extending the production by 4 months. The budget effectively doubled. Final estimates ranged from $250 to $300 million. For a mid-budget spin-off, Solo earned $393 million worldwide, a number that would be completely fine for almost any other franchise. For Star Wars, it was a disaster. The film reportedly lost tens of millions of dollars, and Disney CEO Bob Iger publicly said it caused them to rethink how frequently they were releasing Star Wars content. The annual release model was shelved. The planned spin-offs were abandoned. One chaotic production changed the course of the entire franchise. Number 1. Waterworld, 1995. And here we are. 30 years later, Waterworld is still the reference point. When a production starts going sideways, people still reach for it as the comparison. It is the canonical Hollywood disaster, so notorious that journalists coined nicknames for it in real time. Fishtar, Kevin's Gate. References to 2 of the biggest flops in history applied to one movie before it even finished filming. How did we get here? The original pitch was simple: Mad Max, but on water. In 1986, the writer described it in exactly those words and figured it could be made for $30 to $35 million. By 1992, when Kevin Costner and director Kevin Reynolds signed on,
Universal had approved a budget of $100 million. Still ambitious, but workable. Steven Spielberg personally warned Costner not to shoot on open water. He'd learned that lesson the hard way making Jaws. Costner and Reynolds ignored him. Within 3 weeks of filming off the coast of Hawaii, a hurricane destroyed the main set, a massive floating atoll structure that had cost millions to construct. They rebuilt it from scratch. That was the beginning. Everything that could go wrong did. Salt air ate through equipment. Ocean currents pushed camera crews out of position. Communication between departments was chaos when everyone was scattered across floating platforms. A stunt coordinator nearly died from decompression sickness. During a scene involving a boat, the bowsprit snapped, throwing child actress Tina Majorino and co-star Jean Triplehorn into the water. 12 safety divers pulled them out. Kevin Costner himself was lashed to a mast on a sinking vessel for a scene and couldn't free himself as the boat went under. He survived, obviously, but still. The scheduled 96-day shoot ran to 157 days. The relationship between Costner and Reynolds deteriorated so badly that Reynolds quit before the film was finished, leaving Costner to direct the final sequences himself. Joss Whedon was brought in for 7 weeks of emergency script rewrites, a job he later described as essentially doing whatever Costner told him to do. Budget started at $100 million, climbed to $135, settled at $175 million, the most expensive film ever made at that point in history. Marketing and distribution brought the total spend to around $235 million. The film opened at number 1. It earned $264 million worldwide. It finished in the top 12 grossing films of 1995, and Universal still lost over $100 million on it. The movie that defined financial catastrophe almost worked, which might actually be the saddest part of the whole story.
Here's what I keep coming back to when I look at this list. Almost none of these films were made by cynics chasing a paycheck. They were made by people who genuinely believed in what they were building. Travolta convinced he was adapting a masterpiece, Besson finally making the movie he dreamed about since childhood, the Wachowskis swinging for something original in a franchise-obsessed industry. The belief was real, the ambition was real, the failure was also real. Sci-fi is uniquely dangerous territory for this reason. Every other genre has a natural ceiling on spending. You can set a drama in someone's living room, shoot a thriller on a real city street. Sci-fi has to build its worlds from nothing, and imagination doesn't come with a price tag attached. Once you start, it's very hard to know when to stop. The studios will keep forgetting this lesson. The budgets will keep climbing. And somewhere right now, a director is looking at the latest cost report and saying, "We just need a little more," convinced, completely sincerely, that this time it'll be worth it. Maybe it will be. But history is not optimistic.